So we started writing Suburani a few years ago, and here's a little overview of some of the main focuses that we had, some of the main needs we identified and things we wanted to do really well at, like suiting a variety of teaching approaches and increasing representation of women and girls and a diversity of the Roman population. And that's kind of the underpinnings of the Suburani textbook course. And it's hi from North Carolina, Robin. And we hope that we've met quite a lot of these goals when we wrote the book and the digital resources as well. And we'll be focusing on some of these themes as we go through our introduction in a minute. So Suburani, we've currently got, if you've got the next slide, Will, oh, you're busy, 2 textbooks out. Book 2 has just come in from the printer, so those of you who might have been ordering that, it will be with you very soon. Will's got a copy.
Can you see that? I don't know if you can.
It's turquoise.
There we go.
There are now 2 student books for Suburani, Book 1 and Book 2. And together, if you're in the UK, those 2 books will take you up to all the content you might want to cover for GCSE. So if you are preparing students for the EduCast GCSE, the first 26 chapters cover all of the language structures that you might need for that. And if you're an OCR GCSE teacher, the full 2 books cover, again, all of the defined vocabulary list and all of the grammar and syntax that you need. If you are a US teacher, those terms, those acronyms won't mean anything to you, but to give you an idea of kind of what levels this treats, Book 1 is a beginner's course, so you'll be looking at your Latin 1 students, and then probably most teachers we've talked to don't really do all of Book 1 in 1 year, so you might find that you move on to Latin 2 at some point in Book 1, maybe around 2/3 of the way in, and then continue into Book 2 for Latin 2, and maybe you might make a start on Latin 3 if you're in Book 2, but these circumstances differ so much depending on your own curriculum and your teaching time and your syllabus. So
one thing, just to chip in there, Laila, one thing that we've had in all the trialing, of course, has been all with all the COVID and people at home and people at school, so that sometimes I think slowed schools down a little bit as well.
Yeah, exactly. In exceptional times, it'll be even different. So each book has 16 chapters, and the storyline continues throughout the 2 books. And each chapter is 16 pages long, and 10 pages of that, so 2/3, is made up of language. And the vast majority of those pages are Latin stories, some of them illustrated, but they're also supported by language notes, which give explanation about the new language for the chapter, and language practice pages, which are there to consolidate their understanding, where they do some language manipulation exercises. There's 5 pages of civilization content for each chapter that pick up on a particular topical theme, integrated together with the stories, which will already have exposed students to the cultural topic for the chapter. And then there's 1 page per chapter on either some Roman mythology or some history. So that differs per chapter. Usually it sort of takes it in turn, but it's not a precise pattern. Sometimes you'll see 2 myth or 2 history chapters in a row. And these provide a very broad starter's introduction to a variety of topics of mythology and history. So today we'll take you through each of those aspects in a sort of whirlwind tour to give you an idea about the approaches we took when we created these resources. So we'll talk about the language, we'll talk about the civilization, we'll talk about the storyline and the characters that make up the plot of the 2 books. And we'll touch briefly as well on myth and history, as well as the digital resources that we've got. So we're going to do a whirlwind tour, but if you want to know a little bit more, sort of have an overview of exactly what's included in each chapter on all of those aspects, if you head to scope.suburani.com, you'll find there's a few documents there that explain in more detail exactly what's included in each chapter. So at the top left, you'll see the Book 1 overview, and there's one like that for Book 2 as well. And it tells you per chapter, what's the language, what's the culture, and what's the history or mythology content. And then the document that I've pasted in the bottom right is the storyline summary. So if you're preparing to teach and you just want to find out, here I've got chapter 11 up, what are the stories in chapter 11? Who are they about? What's a summary of the story? And what kind of language can I expect to see in them? And what kind of cultural topics do they raise? So if you want to know more of that kind of planning stuff and what's included where, then go have a look at scope.suburani.com. And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Hannah, who's going to introduce you to the characters in geography.
Great, thanks, Laila. So I won't talk too much about the storyline, because there's a separate session about the storyline of books 1 and 2 at the same time as this session on Friday. So I'm just going to go through and introduce some of the faces and the places of Suburani. And because I'm going to go through it quite quickly, there may seem like lots of characters and maybe it's not going to quite hold together, but if you come back on Friday, you'll see the whole narrative. And so I'm just going to introduce some of the characters and the locations. So Suburani starts out, its first 6 chapters are in Rome, and we focus particularly on the Subura, where our characters are from, but we also visit lots of different sites like the Forum and the Circus Maximus. And so by the end of these first 6 chapters, the student should kind of start to feel quite familiar with Rome and its layout. And the core characters that we meet in these first 6 chapters will mostly continue throughout the course. So in the center, we have the family of Sabina. So Sabina, who's a young girl, and we have her father, Faustus, who runs, he's a landlord of an insula. Her aunt, Rufina, who runs a bar in the Subura, and she runs it with her parrot. And then Lucrio, Quartella, and her son, Corax, who are all enslaved in the household of Faustus. And so they live and work alongside the family in the Subura. On the left, we've got Gisco, who's a veteran soldier. So he's a Numidian cavalryman, and his British wife, Katia, and so they've just arrived together, and they have a young child who we find out later is called Atto. And so they've just moved from Rome from Londinium with their dog Keller, and they end up renting a room in the insula of Faustus. They're situated in the Subura as well. And Indus on the far left is also a soldier. He's a friend of Gisco, and they bump into each other by chance in Rome. And Indus actually comes to play quite a key part of the storyline by the end of the book. So again, come back on Friday to learn more. And finally, on the right, we've got Lucilius. So he is an equestrian who, in the very earlier stories, seems a bit out of place in the Subura amongst the other characters. And we will catch up with him a bit later as well. So we start with these characters in the Subura in the heart of Rome. And throughout the course, we travel to lots of different places within the empire. So following different characters and meeting new people and cultures in each place, but always following one of these core characters around. So starting in the Subura, but after these first 6 chapters, we go to a flashback in the bar in Rome with Gisco and Indus and Katia narrating stories about their time in Britannia. So there we meet Katia's parents. So if Will can just go into the next, so that's, the breadth of the empire that we travel around. We meet Katia's parents and sister, who are all living quite close to Londinium, which is where Katia and Gisco meet. And we also meet Lucas, who's a Briton, but who comes from near Camalodunum and who has a very different opinion of the Roman occupation. And in this unrest, we also meet Boudica, who rouses the Iceni and all their neighboring tribes to rebellion against the Romans. So in these chapters, the storyline travels to Londinium and then Camalodunum, and finally we finished in Aquae Sulis for the construction of the bath complex there in the wake of the Boudican rebellion. So we're focusing on the province of Britannia, but we get to visit some various places within it. Next in the storyline, we jump down to the south of France. We go briefly to the bar in Rome, and then Sabina, for her own safety, is whisked away to Arles, a town in south of France, where she is looked after by the elderly bakers Letta and Popillus. So they're in the bottom left. So in comparison to Britannia, this is quite a peaceful view of the life in the provinces. But most importantly for our character, on the ship over from Rome, Sabina meets Alexander, who's a mosaicist. And very quickly in our story, Sabina and Alexander travel to Coimbra in the province of Lusitania, which is in modern Portugal. So we're going now further west to Alexander's family home. Sabina and Alexander get a job working nearby Coimbra at the Villa Rabassal. That's a large country estate where Lucilius and his slave Tyro is also happened to be staying. And we end book 1 in Coimbra here with the wedding of Alexander and Sabina. And starting in book 2, we pick up the story of Gisco, who's now living in Pompeii. So again, we move much closer to Rome. So he's there with his son and also with Quartilla and Corax. And in the site of Pompeii, we also meet Julia Felix, who maybe you recognize her name. So she's the owner of an estate in the town of Pompeii. So if you get to visit that, you can visit her estate. And also Ampliatus, who's a very wealthy man with whom Gisco gets into business. So having spent some time in Pompeii, we next travel to Carthage in Northern Africa, where we catch up with Sabina and Alexander, who've traveled there for work. And we also meet their friend Hermione, who's a teacher, and Barca, who's an escaped gladiator. We leave Carthage and we meet Lucilius, who's been sent as a tribune to the province of Achaia. And we spend 3 chapters here in Greece, in Achaia. So we see Athens, Olympia, and Delphi. And in particular, in these chapters, we meet up close for the first time Emperor Nero. So he is on a tour of Greece, winning all the chariot races and music competitions. And we next go in chapter 7. We catch up with Rufina and Lucrio, who are in Ephesus, so one of the eastern provinces. And with all our core characters by now very scattered across the empire, I think it feels like quite a relief to finally find out where Rufina is and come back to, you know, a familiar character. And so she has established herself as a doctor in Ephesus. So here we look at the, you know, the beautiful site of Ephesus, and in particular the temple of Ephesian Artemis. And we also meet Phoebe and Menander, who are barbers in the city, and their son Soranus, who has hopes of also becoming a doctor, so training under Rufina. And in chapter 28, with the arrival of Rufina's friend Zabdella, we take a very quick exploration of Palmyra. So that's on the very eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And Zabdella is a merchant who travels between the cities. So we even look a little bit further east, tracing the Silk routes, so all the way to China. In chapter 30, we return to Rome, and by various means and various reasons, some of our original Suburani characters are back in Rome. I'm not going to say anything more about what happens at the finale, but that is a whirlwind summary of the people and places that you'll meet in Suburani. And so I think next is Laila with the civilization.
Yeah, it does feel like a whirlwind that way, but it feels a little bit less hectic when you're sort of teaching a chapter 2 weeks at a time. I promise you. I'll give you a very quick introduction to sort of the approach we took to putting together the civilization sections for each chapter. If you want to show me, Will, the next slide. There are a lot of chapters and a lot of different topics, and we had to spend quite a bit of time working out what topics that we think were important to treat, but either because they are sort of, you know, really key introductions to Roman concepts, traditions, practices, and which things we might want to include that hadn't often received treatment in textbooks at secondary level because we thought they were particularly interesting or because they opened up different perspectives for the students. So across the 32 chapters, we've got a very wide variety of topics, and some of those will appeal to certain teachers and students more than others. And we very much imagine that as you teach with the course, there will be chapters that you spend a lot of time on and chapters that you do pretty light touch, depending on what exams you might be preparing students for, or what holds your interest and what engages your students. So if I have a look at this slide here, this is an introduction in chapter 5 to the Roman baths. And a few things I just wanted to point out here is that we tried, where possible, to have quite a lot of visual imagery to really make the Roman world come to life. And as you looked at some of the stories that Hannah showed you and some of the illustrations that go with the Latin stories, a lot of cultural learning happens through the characters, through the settings, and through the illustrations. And in the Civ sections, again, we bring in lots of visual imagery. So here we've got this construction that Hannah drew of the baths of, I can't remember whose baths they are. I'm sure it says in the text, if not in the teacher's guide. And we tried as well to make sure that they were accessible to read. So we don't fill up 2 whole pages with text. We've got it here divided into smaller sections so that they become engaging and accessible for students to read and to make sense of. This is obviously a very key kind of introductory topic, the baths, and you'll find all the sort of tick boxes on it of, like, you know, a typical Roman town, daily life, things like the baths, the chariot races, gladiators, all of that is done, and all of the information is there that you might want to introduce your students to. If you look at the next slide, we also wanted to make sure that the civilization sections didn't just give factual information, but really got students to think about, how do we know about what the Roman world was like? What kind of evidence have we got for that? And what different interpretations might there be of that evidence? Because so much of what we know about the Roman world is just not straightforward. And we thought it was really important to introduce students from the very first chapters to the primary evidence. So here are 2 different pages from 2 different chapters that take this kind of source-based learning approach, where the students themselves can look at what an English translation says of some Latin, or sometimes the actual Latin is included if it's accessible, or there might be visual imagery, archaeological evidence, or art that we present. And then we include, often in the book and also very often in the teacher's notes, discussion questions, starting points for getting students to think about what this evidence might tell them about the Roman world. And it can be on topics like charioteers or private worship, but it can also be about topics that are a little bit more gnarly or sensitive or complicated and open to different interpretations. So if you have a look at the next slide, actually, I'll talk about that in a minute, but yes, here you go. These 2 pages about resistance or acceptance of Roman rule, and on the other side, the experience of enslaved people in a variety of settings, are really there to get students to cope with concepts that are quite difficult. You know, there are lots of different attitudes to Roman imperialism that we see. These are all 3 different case studies from people who lived in Roman Britain, and some evidence from Tacitus. How do those 3 perspectives differ, and to sort of get across to students that there's no simple or straightforward answer to this, right? It's not that everybody felt the same about being ruled by the Romans. The stories bring that out, and the civilization sections do the same. The same with this topic here of the life of a slave. We thought it was important to include topics that might be sensitive in some classrooms, that might be difficult to treat, that might lead to a lot of debate. There is support for that as well in the teacher's notes, but you'll find across the chapters, there are chapters where we broach topics that are a little bit more complex for students to get their head around. Sorry, going back to the last slide, which is clearly in the wrong order. We've also included some topics that are a bit different because we just thought they were really interesting, because we talked to a load of teachers. Early on, we did a big sort of exploration with teachers about what they found interesting to teach. And a lot of things came out of that we wouldn't have done traditionally. So here's a page on mining at Las Medulas and different mining techniques that were used by the Romans. We've got several sections like this. There's one about making bread as well, that sort of include science, technology in the classroom, and that just take a different view. We've got a section about animals in the Roman world, a section about various aspects of the sea. So some of these pages are a little bit different and will probably expose you to things you might not have seen before. And we're hoping that it'll really appeal to a wide variety of students and interests, as well as teachers. Right. Again, have a look at scope and sequence if you want to know all about every topic across the 32 chapters. And I'll hand you over to Will, who's going to talk to you about language.
Thanks, Laila. Okay, let's have a little look then at how we approach the language content of the course. This is the language content of the first 16 chapters, so book 1. The way we went about it was to look at what is required in the national Latin exams in the US and in the GCSEs in the UK. And happily, you know, there was a very, very high degree of overlap, as one might expect, really, when you're putting together, you know, beginners courses. And we took all of those concepts and essentially, you know, if we sort of zip ahead, there's book 2. We put each one of them as a separate concept, and then we just started to move them around and organize them and think, well, we've got 32 chapters. We don't want really any more than 3 language points per chapter. And so it really was a case of just thinking, well, what makes more sense to come when, and so on. So if you look at the first 6 chapters, we start with the present tense, first, second, and third persons. And one of the reasons for doing that is that straight away allows those teachers who want to have the students talking a little bit to say, well, I do this, you do that, to start asking some questions. Do you do this? And so on. So so bringing in those three persons of the verb straight away seems to work quite nicely. Then we move into nominative and accusative. Now, one thing to say, obviously, is the heart of this course is a reading course. And very quickly, one finds, obviously, when one's trying to write stories, that really the first thing you need is a subject, an object, and a verb. So very quickly, we try to bring in nominative and accusative. And within that, then we talk about the idea of declensions. And we very gently pin gender to those declensions and raise it as a concept that we're going to have to, to be aware of in Latin, that nouns have gender. And some of us, I know some of us are very determined to make sure all the students learn the gender of every noun they come across. And others of us take a much more laissez-faire approach and say, well, actually one can make a good deal of progress reading Latin without knowing the first thing about gender and adjectival agreement based on gender. So, there's a big world, isn't there, of all of us with different views, but it's gently in there. And you can see then how that develops as we bring in the nominative plural. Obviously, we're going to have to bring in a third person plural of the verb, and in the next chapter we wrap up the persons of the verb in chapter 4 there, and drop in neuters. In 5 you can see what we're doing there. So by the end of chapter 5 we've got all of the present tense plus the infinitives. Then we're into ablatives, because we're using prepositional phrases quite a lot from the outset, because we want to say, somebody is in this place and they're doing something here and so on. Then we explain the ablative. So that those first 6 chapters, if you like, are a little section of learning, a little unit of learning in their own right, really. And with me in the sort of the situation that I normally find myself teaching in, that might be 1 term's work between September and December. So we might go, for some of you that might seem very fast, and that's on around about an hour and a half a week. So that isn't a vast amount of time to cover that material, and I know others of us may take a fair bit longer. Oh, sorry. I think the other thing to say there is that in terms of the pacing, the trials have shown that it's it's sort of twice half its length, really. It'll take up as much time or can be covered as quickly as you want. The overall, those schools that start earlier with younger students, and I'm thinking of sort of 11-year-old students, they might, and if they have a roughly 2 hours a week in the UK, they might take 2 years to do book 1. Those schools in the US who have more time per week, if maybe you've got 50 minutes a day, then you might quite happily go 1 chapter every 2 weeks, I would have thought. But I would say if you try it out, the first year it's going to be suck it and see, isn't it? And it's going to depend on how much is remote and how much is face-to-face and so on. Moving on to the Britain section, here, chapters 7 to 10, starting to bring in past tenses. In chapter 9, we were going to do the genitive, but actually as we were writing it, we found we needed the dative more in our sentences than we needed the genitive. So we changed that around and switched them between 9 and 11. And in 10, we bring in adjectival agreement. In 12, we're really wrapping up, the cases there, and then we're starting to move into sort of other areas of syntax and grammar. One thing to say, the color coding here: blue is nouns, verb; green is verbs; purple is sort of adjectives; and orange is sort of syntax, sort of concepts. Just so you can get an overview just by looking at that screen of the sorts of things that are going on. Might be surprised that in 15 we've got indirect statement, but actually from a reading point of view, if you look there, we're only looking at present active infinitives. So, and I was just doing that with my class last week, and they're 13 coming on 14-year-olds, and they've covered from chapter 1 through to chapter 15 since September, with a roughly 50% of that time being at home. And I would say my class are the sort of students who, when they're at home, they're not doing any work. No matter how much I might encourage them. So indirect statements there, perhaps surprising, but it seems to be working out very well. The students don't find it actually a particularly difficult concept. They do it literally, and it's pretty easy to switch that into good English. The second book, chapters 17 to 19, there we're aiming to wrap up the active indicative. So we do the pluperfect, wrap up the futures, and we do present participles. Then when we go to North Africa, the Carthage section, that's where we're doing passives. So at that point, we move into passives. So 20, 21, and 22 passives. Then 23 through to 26. So Rome and Greece, we're doing subjunctives. So perhaps we feel in the US, we're sort of heading towards the end of Latin 2. Maybe this is starting to bring us into Latin 3, depending on your program. Those of us in the UK, if you're using Educas exam board, the end of chapter 26 is the end of everything you need to do for UK Educas language for GCSE. And if you're in the UK and doing OCR, chapters 27 to 32 is all of your OCR specific material. If you're not in the UK, you can see there as we go through 27 through to 32, we're starting to get into slightly more complicated ideas, adjective absolute, pushing the envelope a little bit. I mean, with the verbs and so on. If you look at the color scheme there, book 2, as often as these courses develop, becomes quite heavy from a verb point of view. So we really are getting into quite a lot of different moods and voices and tenses. Okay, so that's the grammar overview of the 32 chapters. And again, on the whole, three points of language per chapter. Very often, if you look at sort of 24, 25, and 26, very often where we've got 3 language notes, actually, one, maybe even 2 of them are not that heavy. If you look at 24, for me, the result clauses would be the thing that I really want to be focusing on there. Compound verbs, it's not going to be a big deal. I don't think the students are going to struggle with that at this point. And, hands up, really don't, in my context that I'm teaching, I don't really worry about the 4 declension, vast manner. So we just simply, I let them know that it exists. And those who are really good, well, they can get into it. But most of us are focusing on the first 3 declensions. Okay, I just want to talk to you a little bit about vocabulary. And again, this is trying to make the best of the ideas in the UK and the best of the ideas in the US. So you can see here, this is just the start of the spreadsheet. We track every individual item of vocabulary that we use in the book. Down to, you can see here, differentiating between R and AB. And the first thing, this is super boring, but I love this sort of thing. Categorization of vocabulary. This word R or AB, we categorize that as B1, and the B is a UK thing, which means it's in both exam board lists, and the 1 is more appropriate normally for North America, which is, this is how frequent it is based on the Dickinson 1000 list. So a 1 means it's in the top 500, a 2 means it's in 501 to 1000, and a 3, if you take something like row 15 here, actor, that's N3. That means it's not in the Dickinson 1000, and it's not in any UK exam list either. But you're going to really write a Latin course without the word actor, and I've never met a student struggle with that word. So it's not going to find its way into any learning list, because A, it's not important for anybody, and B, you don't need to learn what that word means, right? So we also, none of these need a separate column E there. We track, if we need a separate gloss for North America, because sometimes we refer to, words differently, don't we? Whether column F is, have we lacked a meaning? So you take something like peto. Peto has like about 1,000 different meanings, doesn't it? So we gradually run through them, and now that we've finished, that column F will have, nothing in it. And then this is all those same words, tracking them again by part of speech, conjugation or declension, whether they end up in the vocab list. Here you can see in column P, that's where we track the Dickinson frequency. You could look at Legayon frequencies as well. They, on the whole, they're pretty similar. We track where the word first appears, the third time it appears, because we won't put a word, I think maybe there are 1 or 2 exceptions in the whole course, but overall, we won't put a word in a learning list unless it's appeared 3 times. And then the rest of these columns needs to go on and on, track, how many times has this word appeared by the end of that chapter. So obviously in the initial chapters, quite a lot of these words haven't appeared at all. But we track them and then we see, right, this word hasn't been used for quite a while, so let's put it in a language activity, perhaps sort of sentences for translation or language manipulation, so that we make sure the students get a pretty regular sort of a chance to see the word. So quite a lot of time spent mapping those things and checking all of that. So here are the learning lists. Every chapter we give 20 words for learning. In books 1 and 2, I think across the piece, 85% of them are Dickinson, in the Dickinson 1000. Something like in list 3 here, and killer, slave, enslaved person, female. We've tried to move away from talking about slave for Serwus and female slave or slave girl for ankilla. We try to treat those things in the same way. So an enslaved person female and an enslaved person male, for example. Now that word is, it's in the UK learning list, but it's not in the Dickinson 1000, but we still felt it's an important word to put in there. So if you're in the UK, all of the learning lists for the first 16 chapters, they are all DVL words for both lists. And if you're in North America, 85% of those words are, high value Dickinson 1000. When we get into book 2, again, these are all, well, 85% are Dickinson 1000 words. And then in the UK edition of the course, there's a difference here between the 2 editions. In the UK edition of the course, because we can no longer use words that are all in both lists, then we've colored up whether it's an EDUCAS word or an OCR word, depending on those little icons. If you're in using the North American edition of the course, you won't see those things there. Okay. When the students use the dictionary at the back of the book, they'll see they get little numbers to the left of the word sometimes, and that's just to tell them that this is in a learning list. So if I looking up this word, for example, if I'm looking at Gaudium and I'm in chapter 28, well, it's a little note to self, I should know that word by now. There's a very small English to Latin dictionary in the book for basic work. It's not vast. It covers, again, if you're in the UK, it covers the core words you need to have for English into Latin in the exams. I think our feeling is that we can put a much more comprehensive list online for those of us who want to do much more of that English into Latin. Very quickly, the approach of the course, if you've not seen it, and if you haven't got a copy of the book, we will give a free copy to every school in North America, well, in the world, in fact. So do get in touch if you haven't had a free copy. But the approach is to start with someone like Sabina here, and we're trying to see the world through her eyes. So she's saying ego sum Sabina, and we'll use these I and you and he, she, it forms of the verb here, but we're combining language learning with cultural learning. So we don't see the two as separate. We can find out what we mean by an insula by defining it in the dictionary, or you can see a picture and say, okay, often it's the picture gives a better idea, doesn't it, of what actually is an insula. So, my view is you can't really separate language from culture, because a weir, what do we mean by a weir? Well, it's not a 4-lane motorway highway, is it? It's a sort of a stone thing with, maybe if you're in a street, you've got some stepping stones over it. So words do have sort of cultural significance, of course. And here again, we're seeing the character in this place and plenty of opportunity through these initial stories to use the images to help the students understand what the Latin means. So most chapters start with a graphic novel sort of approach where we can use the images, as we've designed this, you know, those of us who work on the language side have said to Hannah, who works on the illustrations, can we make the image have this in it so that it will help the students understand this new language point? So these things are designed to work together very, very closely. And the culture then picks straight up on that. You know, it's not chance that this cultural topic is the Subura when we've just been looking at a scene set in the Subura. So those things are designed to work very closely together. For those of us, you know, some of us, and I work a lot with teachers who feel very comfortable with the language, very uncomfortable with the culture, the teaching notes have huge amounts of help. So please, please, please use them, because we spend absolutely hours and hours and hours writing them. And it's like any manual, you know, I'm the worst person for that sort of thing. I'll just pick, you know, the machine up and try and work out how it works. Please do, you know, use these notes. If you're not used to a reading course or one which has got so many images in it, again, you know, these notes will have loads of ideas of how to approach. It doesn't do this all the way through the course, but the first couple of chapters to set you up with sort of ideas of concepts of how can I go about using these sorts of materials. Lots more information there. We have quite often at the start little skits so that you can get the children acting out if you want to, but we also move into, you know, the sort of normal narratives. Try to keep the stories shortish so that they don't take a long time to teach. As we go into book 2, we try to sort of put a nod to literature. So this is, if you look at Julia there in line 17, or maybe in Julian 15, Bene tu cannabis migisco. So, you know, that's clearly a reflection of Catullus, and then you could move to reading the Catullus there. I think Hannah didn't want to give too much of the ending away, but, you know, this is just to show that the progression by chapter 32, by the end, this is slightly adapted Suetonius. So, you know, the whole course is designed to move students to the point where they are used to reading things that are close to original Latin. I think I would still want to do a little reader in between that and you know, the chapter 32 and doing a lot of original literature, and we'll work on that ourselves in the next year or two, putting together some ideas. But that's the aim there. Very quickly, sorry, I need to zoom on today. The language points in the book, very light touch in the book, but online we're working on putting more detailed things together. So if you want to get into conjugations in chapter 1, you can. If you don't want to, that's what's in the book. So light touch in the book, more detail coming online for those who want to do that. I'll skip past that because time's short. Okay. And back now, is it Hannah, you picking up?
Yeah, that's me. Okay, so every chapter has got one page which is either a myth or a history topic. So they usually alternate, but sometimes you do have 2 mythology in a row. And there's always a connection between the civilization content in the chapter or the storyline to that myth. But they also sit kind of separately from the core content. So if you don't have a huge amount of time, that might be something that you don't have much time to dedicate to in the lesson, but at the same time might be a lovely opportunity as a kind of springboard to further research or projects for your students. So yeah, they look at the mythology first. So the mythology pages, they don't retell the myth. So instead they provide topics of discussion, and they provide sources to study around the myth. So it's a really nice opportunity to look at some ancient, but also some modern art, and also discuss some Roman ideas and maybe look at some more sensitive topics such as, you know, gender in the context of myth. And we also sometimes include some snippets of Roman authors. So if you did have some extra time, you can go off and look at a more expanded version of, say, you know, the Metamorphoses from Echo and Narcissus. And we've got a wide range of myths and topics that come out of, and the topics that come out of them introduce lots of discussions. So here we've got the Amazons, so the idea of female power. So you can really take that any way you want and do research projects into other cultures if you have the time. And they also look at the reception of classics over time, and particularly the visual sources can help with that connection to the Romans and the ancient world, and think about why we're still telling the same stories and asking the same questions. So here the Titian in source 4, say, from the National Gallery. And we go quickly on to the history. So the history pages in the textbook, they're not organized in chronological order. So they aim to cover some kind of highlights of Roman history, and investigate some topics, but it won't take you step by step through the different periods. And again, they're linked to the topics within the chapters. And the topics are thematic often, and so they encourage the students to think about the theme either across different time periods or across different areas of the empire. So these pages should help contextualize the other content in the chapter, and also help the students understand the importance of how the history of Rome, so what came after or what came before, to help them understand what they've been learning in the civilization. And there's quite a range in the topics and how they've been structured. So, the Parthians looks at the relationship between the two civilizations. Africa and Rome just takes a few snapshots of Roman contact with these different cultures in the south of the empire. But there's also a page on the archaeology of Pompeii, which you can go into more, sorry, it's not in the presentation, but more ideas about conservation or the role of museums, how to preserve those findings. So kind of a springboard for these topics to go off into lots of different research avenues. And there's also a nice geographical spread, so you can look at different populations in all the locations that we go to. So you can look at Africa, Greece, and some of the more eastern provinces before the arrival of the Romans, and then how that changes. And each of these topics could kind of lead you further into separate research projects. And so we've got a few examples that we've just been flashing across the screen, but again, if you go to the scope and sequence document, you can see the full list and have a look at the whole range of topics. And I think next it's the technology with Tony.
Great. I'm going to share my screen in place of Will's. So you can see some of the activities we've got. Here we go. It's technology, but it's not the water wheel we saw. I'm not teaching you to build a wooden water wheel. This is digital technology that we have for the course. The whole course is available in digital form. And there are some schools who decide they'd rather teach it that way. A lot of schools use it hybrid, digital and paper, which I think is a very successful way. So here we got the list of the chapters in the book, as we've seen before. And I'll take you straight into chapter 21, which is set in Carthage, North Africa. This is the chapter page. I'll go into the active book in a moment, but it's full of information that will support this chapter. The web links, a curated list of very interesting topics and ideas that you can follow up with the students. This is like a concertina. You just click on the bar and it opens up. The chapter is full of original images, and we keep a image gallery of very high quality, and we can click on that to go into sorry, let's go back. Look into that. Let's just go into this one. As you can see, it's very high quality, and you can even click on it to go really close in if you want to look at the quality of the letter carving or whatever. Okay, that's the image gallery. We've got some activities and games, but I'll get into those when we get into the later on in the chapter. We've got some very detailed maps that Hannah's drawn. Again, they blow up into a very large size. Reference works. These are available in all the chapters. Some of them are across the board, like the reference gamma here is for the whole course, or well, the whole of book one, whole of book two in this case. We're in book two. Information about timelines, ancient authors and so on. We've got a digital dictionary and a print dictionary that you can download. I won't go into those. And then at the bottom, we've got resources. The hands up ones are ones we've built for you. And there's not so many in this chapter, but there are a lot of downloadable PDFs and resources with extra exercises and extra information that you can use. And the community resources are similar things which have been provided by teachers who've been working on the course. And they're very varied because obviously different people have different approaches, but by sharing them on the community, we can you can pick out the ones that you're really interested in. Okay, let's go into the active book. Again, we've got this sort of concertina type of thing, but all of the chapter is in there. So here we go to one of the illustrated stories of Sabina and Alexander. And look at that. The good thing about this here is that you can click on words that you don't know and be told what they mean. So here, what does Calida mean? Calida's hot. You get the parsing as well, the morphological analysis. If you want, you can turn off up at the top of the screen here, the story controls, the parse. And so when you click on it again, it just gives you the meaning. You don't have to have the parsing as well. And all the words are done in a similar way. We've also got a roots button here up at the top, and that will underline various words which you can find extra information about in other languages. So Leonem, for instance, you've got English, French, and Spanish. We're making this wider and wider, more and more languages as we get specialists to put it out for us. And we've got Korea and Video. Okay, so that's the active book, which is, as I say, a complete version with all the beautiful pictures of the chapter. And then we've got some interactive activities, and I'm going to show you very quickly a sorting activity. Here we go. We've got a pool of words, and you're just asked to say, are they first, second, or third? I, you, or they? And then down at the bottom, you've got little bars that you can click, and it'll move them down into that category. There we go. You can use the buttons at the bottom. As you see, the bars move up. And so if you want to keep clicking very quickly, you can use the buttons at the bottom, the 1, 2, 3, or even the 1, 2, 3 buttons on the keyboard. And we can finish this off quite quickly. I got a couple wrong there. So I try again. They go back in the pool, and I try and get them right this time. And yes, we're going on. You see that we got a couple wrong there, so the scores changed. We'll go very quickly through this. Get a couple wrong. And you'll see it only gives you 3 goes, 3 chances to go all the way through. And I'll go very quickly through the next one so that we can get this one right as far as I can. And then you can see the results, which are saying how quickly you managed to get to the right answer. And it gives you a score as well. The My Sorting is a record. All of this is tracked, which is why students and teachers need to sign into the system. So you can say, oh, I've done these ones. These are ones I've done already. And you can get exactly the same information. It's all held how you did on that particular activity. And again, the teacher is going to be able to see this as well. I'll show that later. Right, another activity we've got is the auto-graded translations. This is where you get a Latin sentence and then you translate it into English as best you can, and program will mark it for you. The teacher doesn't have to mark it for you. I'll get this right, first of all. You see, I'm putting the prepositional phrases in quite a different order from how they occur in the Latin, because the program works out what you're trying to say and finds sees how well you've managed to achieve that. So that's 100%. Now, if I go in again and make a few mistakes, you'll see how it marks it. Okay, so obviously fourth and third, it didn't like third. Came, it wanted ran or did run, and C wasn't right, it was a bridge, it wasn't pontem, it's pontem. What's interesting is you can now click on the Latin words, and it says ora at the hour, quarter, fourth, ad urbem, that phrase comes to the city, and so on. And you can do it the other way around. So which is a word for bridge, across the bridge, which is a word, the phrase for with my friends, and so on. So you can learn quite a lot. Again, we've got my translations, and you get a summary of how you did on that one, how it was marked. So again, this is really useful. This is what your teacher will see if they log in and look at the class and say, how's this particular student doing? The other activity we've got, and this is a fairly key one, is the vocabulary trainer. We call it a trainer because it's not too much focused on testing people. We're just helping people get through those 640 words progressively as you go through the book. So you can choose which chapter you're going to be tested or trained up to, and you've got the option of including words from previous chapters. So you can move forward in the course, even though you've not completely mastered the earlier ones. And then we just get going. So largely they are multiple choice and typing questions. When you first meet a word, you'll also get a kind of flashcard approach. There won't be an example of this because I've been doing this chapter for a while. And you can just click the word and it moves on, gives you it records that you've marked that one correctly. If you get it wrong, you have to click on the right one to get it to move on. Here's a type-in question. As you see, we're trying to avoid students being held back because they've mistyped something. So if you can type the first 3 letters, it'll then pop up appropriate possibilities from the vocab that would complete that. And then you can just click on that. And it means you can move through this much more quickly. And that's correct. And it tells you what the other possibilities might have been. At any point, you can click in this top left, how am I doing? And you get the overview of how well you know each chapter, words in each chapter. And if we look at chapter 11, which we're in at the moment, it tells you in detail how well each word is going. You can get up to level 10 on a word. And the program tries to exercise words across the board, words you haven't seen for a while. I mean, this here is just recording what level you're at, but it's also records how long it is since you've seen a word. So you can make sure it's the idea of spaced repetition, that you bring back words that you haven't seen for a while. So just to confirm and to reinforce. And very quickly, you can log in as a teacher. We can go back to a class, there's only two in this class, and you get a summary of how they're doing in each of the chapters. You only go up to 26 here, but you can click on it and you see the same as the student saw, and you can see in detail which words are causing problems, which ones they know. And over time, we hope to have more analysis of this so that you can see how your whole class are doing, which words they find difficult, and so on. So that is a whirlwind tour of our interactive technology, our digital technology. I'm going to be talking about it in much more detail tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.